Hello, and welcome to another World of UX podcast. This is your host, Darren Hood. Thanks, everybody, for taking the time to join us on today. A special welcome, as always, to those who are joining us for the first time. We have an extremely special session set up for you today, but I'm going to set the table for it first. First, I want to remind people, and this is actually part of what I'm about to mention to you. We're coming up on the anniversary of the show. I believe this is our 4th anniversary. I have a tendency to not count anniversaries, but we've been doing this for a while now. We're over 200 episodes. I'm always excited. I love sharing with the UX community. And so as we normally do around anniversary time, we have some special sessions set for this time, of which this is one. So let me set the table for this. Oftentimes people, they come to me a lot and they ask me, you've seen it, I'm sure, on especially on LinkedIn, what are the most important tools for UX professionals today? My answer is always the same. People are waiting on me to say Figma. They're waiting on me to say Sketch. They're waiting on me to say something like that. And then I throw a monkey wrench, as apparently is my job, to throw monkey wrenches out there. And I always say the most important tool is the human mind. Tools are tools. And so whatever we do, it has to start in the head. It's if we can't start things off in the head, Figma's not going to magically take us to another plane. The different tools that are out there, they won't. And so I constantly tell people, whether it's with my students, whether it's with mentees, whether it's a standard general conversation about UX, I always tell people that if you want to thrive in UX, it's all about optimizing what's happening upstairs in our head, and it's all about optimizing cognition. So setting the table for what I think is going to be this is, for those of you who aren't willing to exercise your brain muscle today, you're going to have a problem. I'm going to tell you now with this show. And so here we go. Our guest today in this session, in this wonderful anniversary, thank you for being, I'm going to say this now, and to let our guests know, I always let our guests introduce themselves. So I just set the table. I'm going to say a couple things, and I'm going to hand it over to you for your intro. But I'll give you some of the basic stuff. Today's guest, their name, the guest is Jorge Arango. He is the co-author of what a lot of us are familiar with. He's a co-author of Information Architecture for the Web and Beyond, which nobody even says that anymore. We just say the Polar Bear book. They don't get into the title. It's the Polar Bear book. And people if they don't know what that is, they're new to UX. He's also the author of a book entitled Living in Information. I have not bought this yet. I have an extensive library. This book will be in my library by the time the day is over, because I love people who help us stretch, people who help us to charge us to be our best selves. And I love that. And that's what I see in him. His book, Living in Information, Responsible Design for Digital Places. Got to have that. And I'm sure we're going to talk about this one quite a bit today. I know this was my focus in preparing for this episode. He is the co-author of the book entitled Duly Noted, Extend Your Mind Through Connected Notes. So today, I am so honored to have with me today, and the person I'm going to be speaking with in this episode, Jorge Arango. Take it away, Jorge, and tell the world who you are.
Darren, thank you so much. I'm so honored. It's such a privilege to be here, and congratulations on this anniversary. I mean, it's quite an accomplishment to be doing this for so long and to have so many episodes. And I am truly honored to be here on this special day. You asked me to introduce myself. I'll try to be really brief. Okay. I am an information architecture consultant. So I help organizations design systems that are easier to use and understand. Mm-hmm. And I do that by structuring information. You mentioned the Polar Bear book. So I've been focused on information architecture for a long time. It's I'm on my third decade of working in our field, which is, I feel really old saying that. But them are the facts, as we say, right? Um, and besides being an information architect, I'm also an educator. So I teach at the California College of the Arts, and I also do online courses where I teach folks about information architecture. And then I'm also an author. As you've noted, I've worked on 3 books. I co-authored the 4th edition of the Polar Bear book, and then the other 2 that you mentioned. So I see my identity kind of like wrapped up in those 3 things, right? And they're connected.
Awesome, awesome. Again, for those of you that do not have Jorge's books, please get them. A great book is worth its weight in gold and beyond. I have several book recommendation lists, and so I stand by that. If you want to grow in UX, that's what you need to do, especially when you consider the fact that misinformation was not, I mean, it was very rare, almost non-existent prior to 2011 is the date I like to call out. And so when you find a book, because misinformation is everywhere today, when you find a great book, you want to get it. You want to not only read it, but reread on a regular basis, because we change over time. So it's good to go back and listen to somebody that you read 5 years ago, read it again. You're a different person now. You're going to digest it differently. So yeah, I can't say that enough. But getting into some of the different topics that we're going to cover today, I spent some time going through Duly Noted. I sent Jorge a list of things that I was thinking about, and ironically, I sent him my notes. And so, we're going to get into some of these things. Jorge, feel free to introduce anything you feel at any given time. I think you're the expert on this approach. The more I looked at it, the more I realized, you know what, I've actually been doing this. Airtable has been my thing, but he introduced me to a tool that I'm going to ask him about later on to share in the show, because I don't know how many people are using it. I'll mention it now. Obsidian. Note-taking is fantastic. So, but again, let's get into it. I love one of the things that I saw that stood out to me. Let me bounce around here. And again, let me know if you want to go somewhere different at any given time. One of the first things I saw in the book that stood out to me, and I believe it was in the foreword, and it had to do with the concept of supercharging personal thinking. Can you help to address this with the listeners and help us to understand what it is and what we can do to supercharge our personal thinking today?
Absolutely, and I'm really glad that your introduction to this conversation, your setting of the table, as you said, talked about the human mind as the essential, quote unquote, tool, right, that we need to work on. Mm-hmm. I'll start by saying that I've always been very excited about the idea of somehow augmenting our mind. I remember at one point there was an O'Reilly book called, I think it was something like Mind Hacks. And I remember seeing that and going, oh my gosh, that sounds so cool, right? Like if there's anything I can do to think better, that would be foundational, right? Like everything that we do, if you think better, you're going to be better at pretty much anything, right? That's the premise there.
Yep.
And we have, well, I'll speak for myself. I think this is true of everybody, but I'll speak for myself. Whatever gray matter I was born with is what I'm stuck with, right? So
love that.
It's not going to, you can work at it, right? Like you can there are things that you can do to keep your mind alert and everything, but I'm not going to get like exponentially better results out of the gray matter that I have. Just with just by focusing on the quote unquote meat computer, right? And the question is, what can you do, right? Like what can you do beyond just taking care of your nervous system, your brain, to augment your cognitive abilities? And one of the easiest things that we can do is we can work with things in our environment. We can work on the world. This is something that I think it's fairly intuitive to folks. Um, if you're trying to write something, for example, many of us find it much easier to do that in a space where we have few distractions, right? So if you're, if you're in an office or at home, and you have the ability to close the door, maybe you can put some relaxing music in the background or whatever. You're going to have a very different experience of thinking in that environment that you are if you are, for example, in something like a baseball stadium, surrounded by people who are screaming and there's a game happening and you're trying to pay attention to, like, your attention is going to be split, right? So I think that we all have this experience of setting up our environment to help us think better. And just like that, there are other things that we can do to extend our minds. And for me, a big realization was the idea that you can intentionally use things out in the world to think better. And one of the easiest and most accessible things we use are notes. And we might get into what we mean by notes. It might be worthwhile exploring that.
Yes.
But I wanted to start there because the point is totally related to the way that you introduce the program. The point is to augment your cognition. So let's start there and see where we go from there.
Okay. Matter of fact, I haven't something else queued up, but I think that's a great point you just made. So that everybody, I'm always big on level setting. And when we say notes, I think a lot of times the first thing that somebody is going to go to is taking notes in school, without getting into the weeds and asking ourselves, why did we take those notes? What were we trying to facilitate by taking those notes? Not to mention the fact, side note, most of us were god awful when it came to, we didn't take all the notes in the world, still failed the test, the history test. Let's stop there. As rudimentary as it might seem for some, I think a lot of people will benefit. When you say notes, what exactly, let's elaborate on that. What exactly do you mean? What are we trying to get into, and what are the benefits of note-taking?
Yeah, that's a great prompt. I'll get into it by saying when I was working on the book, and I told people that I was working on a book, like, when you're writing a book, people ask, what is it about, right? And that, whenever I would say it's a book about note-taking, I would get one of two reactions. Some people would say, "Oh my gosh, I really need that. My notes are a mess. I could use better note-taking." That was, I would say, the most common reaction. There was another reaction, which was, "What? A whole book about notes? It's like, what are you gonna, it's like, what are you going to write about, right?" And I think that this stems from the fact that we are all very familiar with notes. Like you said, most of us, I would think, started taking notes in school. And note-taking is one of those things that we do without giving much thought to. But when you start to think about what we mean by notes, you'll realize that we do a lot of different activities in different media that we call notes, but they are actually very different, and they are things that we do for different purposes. I'll give you an example. Looking at your refrigerator and seeing what you might need to get at the grocery store, right? This is something that I think a lot of us have experience with. So you open the fridge door and you realize that you're out of milk, out of eggs, or what have you. So you write on a piece of paper, the list of things that you need to buy. And that is a type of note that you're using to augment your memory, right? It's remembering is a cognitive ability. And I've had the experience, and listeners might have as well. I've had the experience of standing in the grocery aisles going, "Oh my gosh, why am I here?"
Right.
What was the point? What was the point of this trip? if you write it down in a piece of paper, you won't, the piece of paper will hold it for you, right? Like it'll be like a buffer that you take to the grocery store, and then you don't have that uncomfortable moment.
Yes, yes.
That's one use for note, and that's one type of note. Now, if you're reading a book on, let's say, Kindle, right? Kindle gives you the ability to highlight certain passages and write down what you're thinking at the moment, right? That is a different kind of note, right? Like that's not the same. You're doing something different than when you're trying to remember what to buy at the grocery store. That one is more about trying to maybe process what you're reading, maybe trying to contextualize it for yourself. Maybe you're working on a project or something and you're like, oh, this is actually relevant to the thing I'm working on, right? So you're leaving it's almost like a note to self so that you can start synthesizing what you're reading and, extracting value out of it. That is a different use of notes than the grocery store list. And yet we use the same word to describe both. And that, the fact that we have the one word to cover all these, well, I'll give you another one before we move on.
Yep.
You might be planning, this is what I think of as another common use case. Like maybe you're going to give a presentation. So you sit down with a notebook or maybe on your computer and you start writing an outline of the points that your presentation needs to cover, right? Those are also a kind of note, right? Like you're doing the same kind of thing. And it's like your notes in preparation for this presentation that you're making. Maybe you do a little bit of research and you write it down, and that changes the outline, right? Those three use cases are actually very different activities. They are tapping into different cognitive abilities, and yet we talk about them kind of as though they were all notes, right? You also mentioned the school thing, right? Like, which is yet another different type of note taking where you're trying to take down what you're hearing in a lecture, for example. Maybe there are people listening right now to us talk and they're taking notes about what we're saying, right? So all of those are different uses for notes, but we use this single word. And part of what I set out to do with this book is to get us to realize that thinking entails different things. Remembering is a type of thinking, planning is a type of thinking, synthesizing is a type of thinking, and notes are one of these magical tools that can help us with all of those, but they are different. And if you realize that, you can start optimizing them for these different uses.
That is absolutely fantastic. And so that leads me into what I thought we were going to talk about a minute ago. You mentioned famous note takers. Okay, we see what notes are. We see different types of use cases associated with notes. Who are some famous people that use notes, that were famous for using notes, that you listed out in your book? And I'll list out the four that stood out. I'm sure there are more than four mentioned throughout the book, but there are four that are mentioned. Charles Darwin, who you already mentioned, and he talked about, or was said in the book, that he used notes to augment his mind. And he's known as this phenomenal thinker. Well, depending on notes. So it's a superpower. Think of notes as a superpower, folks out there. Definitely got to do that. Here's one that everybody's going to remember or recognize. Leonardo da Vinci. Big note taker. He accomplished many things in his life, and to a great extent because of he used the superpower of note taking. Richard Feynman, I believe I'm saying his name correctly, and I don't know who he is, and I know Jorge is going to elaborate on Richard here momentarily. And Virginia Woolf. These are thought leaders who are renowned throughout history for things that they accomplish. But again, a lot of us, I'm sure a lot of people are going to be like me, who in the world is Richard Feynman? So take it away, Jorge, and introduce us to Mr. Feynman, what he did and how he used notes to augment his performance.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll start by saying that there are a lot of people who have been, let's say, generative, right? I was going to say creative, but but like more generally, like people who have been generative, right? Who have made things, created things. Um, when you start looking at how they went about their work, you'll soon find that they were not relying solely on their, their physical meat
Mm.
computer. They were, they were using the world around them, right? And um, Da Vinci's notebooks are famous, right? Like, and when you look at those, you'll see how he was kind of working out ideas on the page, and I think that that is true for a lot of these folks. Feynman, I'm unsure if it's pronounced Feynman or Feynman, but he was a physicist, a Nobel-winning physicist. Um, he he was influential in many areas of science. I think famously he was part of the team that developed the atomic bomb in New Mexico. In fact, there's he doesn't figure prominently in the film Oppenheimer, but you'll notice that some scenes, if you've seen that movie, you've noticed that some scenes feature this guy kind of in the background playing bongos. That's meant to be Feynman because he was a bongo player
Okay.
and kind of prankster in many ways. He was a fascinating figure. I'll say one other thing. Note that the four people that you listed are now knowing that Feynman is a physicist, like they are scientists and engineers, creative people, right? So Virginia Woolf, creator, right? Da Vinci. I think he straddled both. He was both kind of an engineer and an artist. And then Darwin and Feynman, both scientists, right? And the like I said, the common thread there is that they all used notes to extend their minds. The reason I mentioned Feynman in the book is that he helps. There's a story about him that helps clarify the role that notes play in our lives. I think that many of us are under the impression, it's an impression that I had as well when I was a kid, that what you're doing when you're taking notes is somehow capturing your thoughts. It's somehow like you think the thing and then you write it down, right? Or which I think that's a natural way to think about it. It's a natural model because, like you said, we start our note-taking careers taking down lectures at school, right? Like our serious note-taking careers, right? And in that case, you are kind of taking down what someone else is saying. But there's a story about Feynman where, and this is in a biography of his by James Gleick, where he says that Feynman at some point was being interviewed by a historian, and they were looking at his notebooks. And I'm going to paraphrase because I don't remember the quote exactly, but the gist of it was that the historian said something like, "Oh, so this is where you wrote down the ideas that you had, or something like that, while looking at the notebooks." And Feynman corrected him and said, "No, this is where the ideas happened," or something like that. Right? It's something. The reason I like that is that the message there is this is not so much a recording mechanism as it is an extension of your mind. The thinking isn't happening in the gray matter at the top of your head. It really is happening between your nervous system and the paper in some ways. The paper and the pencil are a part of your thinking apparatus, right? And you might have had this experience. I think that the one that I think a lot of us can relate to is if you've worked out a math problem on paper, writing down the steps, it allows you to make calculations that are much more complicated than you'd be able to do if you were just thinking about it without having something to look at in the world, right?
Yep.
So in some ways, like the thinking is happening between your brain and the paper. So that's why Feynman is in the book.
I love that. And as you were explaining that, a thought that hit me was that I'm a photographer also. And one of the things I think about with photography is Matter of fact, my slogan for my photography operation is capture the moment. And just like you take a picture, you capture the moment, you take a photograph, I should say, and you capture the moment, you're doing the same thing. When you take we talk about it a lot. I need to get this stuff that's in my head out of my head and onto paper. I need to document this, because you get to do the same thing we do with a photograph. You freeze the moment. And so it's like an extended incubator is how I think of it, that we're taking this thing because we got to get it out of our head. If you don't get it out of your head, especially when you consider the frailty of the human mind, we're going to lose it. And a lot of times we do. I tend to document things. If something hits me, if I'm driving and something hits me, I have a secretary. I will call my secretary. Can you document this for me? I'm driving. I can't do anything now. I can't, I don't have a way of saving this for posterity. And if I don't, we may not get it back again. We may not. And then if you do get it back, do you get it back in the same form? And if you don't get it back in the same form, are you have you now limited or stymied your ability, your ceiling with that same thought that you had? So these thoughts are being birthed, these seeds are being birthed, and they're going to need to be cultivated. And if we don't get it into a place where we can cultivate it, then we stand to lose.
I would argue that this is a fantastic example, both of them, both the secretary and the camera, and I want to dwell on them a little bit, because they're great illustrations of an idea that I think it's kind of nuanced, but it's very important, which is when you are we all have ideas. Like let's look at that scenario that you mentioned where you're driving, right? When you're driving, at least when I'm driving, I get ideas, right? Like, because my focus is kind of on the road, but I've been driving long enough where I have like this automatic, I'm kind of on autopilot with the car, and like I'm kind of one with the car. So my mind is free to kind of roam, right? And all sorts of ideas will come to mind. But I would argue that you think differently. Your ideas, you would have different ideas and ideas perhaps of greater depth if you are primed to capture them. And it's not because of it's not necessarily that you're going to use what you captured later. It's that the very presence of the means to capture changes how you think about thinking.
Yes.
Right. And I'll try to tie it back to the camera thing. We all see the world. Well, we don't all see the world. There are obviously people who are unsighted, and this comment does not apply to them, right? But people who are sighted can see the world, and we're moving around, and we're not necessarily paying attention to the things that we see in a compositional way. Let's say that, right? But when you look through the viewfinder of the camera's viewfinder does something important. It adds a frame to the scene.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And the frame of the scene is an important part of, I'm going to use the phrase like photographic thinking, right? You see the world differently through the viewfinder than you do when you're just looking at it, right?
Yes.
And there's something analogous here with note-taking, in that when you are taking notes, you are primed to think differently about the thing that you're thinking. And because of the fact that you have this framing device, let alone the fact that you can then revisit them later, and it serves to like augment your memory. But the fact that you have this framing device at hand means that you will approach your thinking challenges differently.
Yes, absolutely. I love that. I love that. And when you mention frame, that almost takes me down a rabbit hole, so I don't want to do that. I know we're going to be limited on time, because I think about it from an instructional design perspective, because I have that old book about good frames and bad frames, and we were taught instructional design to frame things, and I brought that with me into UX as well. Comes in the form of use cases, micro experiences, things of nature. So I love that, but I will avoid that in great detail. You mentioned when you were talking about those four people, those four note takers, and you mentioned the creative process, and that takes me to my next note that you talked about in the book, that notes can play a role as we start to transition into where the UXer's mind is right now a little bit. There's a role of notes in the creative process. Can you elaborate a little bit on how notes can fuel, enhance the way it can impact the creative process as a whole? So now we're getting into the weeds on where UXers can use notes to become the superpowered UXer, so to speak.
Yeah, well, there's several, and it might be worth. I'm not careful when I say it might be worth noting here because there's yet another use of the word note, right? But I would imagine that there are folks listening in who might be thinking, this Jorge has been telling us that he's been doing design work for the last 30 years or so, and why would a designer write a book about note taking? And it seems like a non sequitur, right? I'll preface my comments about this question by saying that I've been using notes in my work as a designer for a long time. And part of the reason why this book exists is that I had a realization at some point in my career that I made better use of notes than other people that I saw around me.
Mm.
And the insight I had was that part of that was because I was applying what I had learned from information architecture to the way that I structure and manage my notes. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something perhaps to kind of put a pin on. I'm not going to go into that right now, but I'll say that that's part of the genesis of this book. It's almost like bringing information architecture for your own stuff, right? If information architecture is about making things more findable and more understandable, you would want that to be true of your notes, your thinking, right?
Yes. Yes.
So how can designers use notes? Well, there's several ways. One way is the way in which all other knowledge workers use notes, which is to help you pay better attention in things like meetings, right? So you might go to a team meeting where things are discussed. You might get someone might make a request of you that you prepare something by a certain date. And, it would be really helpful for you to take notes about what is being said in the meeting, right? Like who committed to what are the follow-ups that are needed? What are the most important points? That sort of thing. That's one use. Another use is I think that this one is particularly applicable to folks who focus on research, but I think all of us do a little bit of research to some degree or another, right? Which is taking down your observations about what you've learned about the thing that you're designing, right? So if it's the early part of the design process entails understanding the problem domain, and it behooves you to have ways to capture what you learn, think about it, right? Synthesize, and notes are perfect for that. So that's another use. And then the third one that I'm going to call out, and this might be, you might think that I'm kind of stretching the word note here, but sketching is a very important part of the design process, right? And I'm including it here because, again, I consider that to be thinking on paper. And I'm using paper kind of in air quotes, right? Because we can sketch using Figma. We can sketch using an iPad. It doesn't literally have to be pen and paper, right? But what you do, let's take another one that might not be obvious, but when you are standing with your teammates in front of a whiteboard, whether physical or virtual, and putting up sticky notes and moving them around to find clusters, you're engaging in the sort of thinking with the world that I am talking about, right? And I consider those to be different kinds of note taking. In the case of sketching, there's a long tradition of sketching in design. There's a book by Bill Buxton called Sketching User Experiences,
Mm-hmm.
which is focused on this in particular, right? For this discipline.
Yes.
So which is to say, I think that designers need to know about note taking. It's a way of augmenting our minds, and using our minds is what we do, as you mentioned at the top of the conversation here.
Yes. Absolutely. That's phenomenal stuff. Something else that makes me think about has to do with how, I know you've heard this, but some of the listeners have not, that if you're interested in being UX, you've been in UX for 3 years, whatever it is, maybe you've been in UX for 10 years or 15 years, and everybody is going to have this common thread where you either have discovered this or you are going to discover it, and maybe you're going to discover it when I mention it, that being in UX involves a commitment to lifelong learning. And I found a statement in the book that I thought paralleled with this. It was my take on it. And there's a quote from the book that I extracted. It says, unlike products like books or YouTube videos, gardens are not meant to be finished. The point is to keep them going. And when I saw that, it made me think about the lifelong learning component, and especially for aspiring UXers who think that they can learn UX in 6 months. No, 28 years here and still going, and you never arrive, I found. So can you tell the listeners a little bit about these quote unquote gardens and how note-taking taps into that?
Well, I'm really glad that you brought this up, and I'll say, you said 28 years and still learning, and I'll say that is the same for me. I'm like I said, I'm 3 decades into my career, and I still consider myself a noob at a lot of things. I mean, the thing that I'm passionately learning right now is AI, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I know very little about this compared to some of the other things I know, and it's both it's a little intimidating and also very exciting to be exposed to the limits of your knowledge, right? And one of the beautiful things about the field that we work in, Darren, is that because we are working with tech products, basically, and tech platforms, we are working in a field that is evolving and changing all the time, right? So ChatGPT broke into the mainstream, what was it, September of 2022, right? So it's been a little under 2 years. I mean, the generative AI that it represents has been around for longer, but that's when it really became mainstream. And I would argue that that's a technological transformation that anyone who's working in the space has to come to grips with in some way or another, right?
Yep.
I didn't set out to learn about this stuff, but I'm excited that it's here, right? And I feel like my career has been a sequence of things like that. I mean, not many of them are as big or as radical as the generative AI stuff, but another one is spatial computing, right? So, I mean, VR and AR have been around for a while, but now that Apple's in the game, a lot more people are paying attention to that, and that feels to me like new ground for people who do what we do to explore, right? So yes, if you are going to be in UX, you have to commit to you have to acknowledge that you're going to be working in a field that is evolving very fast, and you're going to fare better if you have an open attitude towards learning. Now, the garden metaphor. Folks might not have context here, so I'll just say it up front. The metaphor that is at the core of this book is that of a knowledge garden. And you've hit on the essential aspect of the garden as a metaphor. And I'll say this: the garden metaphor is not original to me. It's been used to talk about knowledge work at least since the 1970s. There was a researcher in Xerox PARC who used this botanical metaphor to talk about it, and I think for many of the same reasons that I gravitated toward it. And the person that where I kind of first heard it, not in the context of knowledge gardening, but just in general, was the musician and producer Brian Eno, who talks about a distinction between architecture and gardening. And the way that Eno frames it is that architecture and gardening are different activities, in that architects and now I'm talking about like building architects, right? So building architects need to plan what they're doing kind of top down. Designing a building is making a building is a pretty expensive undertaking. It's a radical intervention in the environment. It involves a lot of complexity and large investments. So you have to kind of plan up front, right? So it's kind of emblematic of top-down design, what you might think of as top-down design. Whereas gardens, when you work on a garden, you might structure it, like you might have a structure to it. You might decide, well, the tomatoes go over here, the parsley goes over here, this area I'm going to plant flowers or what have you, right? And you might have a plan for how you're going to work on it. But it's a plan that involves things that are growing, that will have seasons, that will have there will be times of year where you are planting, times of year where you are sowing. And it is also an undertaking that requires ongoing work, ongoing commitment. When you design, architects, when they design a building, they design the building gets built, and that, for most architects, that is the end of the engagement, right? Other people take over to maintain the thing. But in gardening, when you are in charge of a garden, when you steward a garden, that's something that you do, right? Like it's an ongoing task, and I think that it's very, sorry for the pun, but it's fruitful to think of the things that you learn and the knowledge that you accrue and develop as something akin to a garden. There are certain ideas that you can think of as the seeds. If you nurture them, they will grow over time. And I'll stay with a metaphor. You will get both nourishment and delight from a garden, right? And that is true of a physical garden, a botanical garden, and it's true of a knowledge garden as well.
Absolutely love that. And the people who listen to this show, they're used to getting all the metaphors, and so there's another metaphor for everybody. I know we don't have much time left, so I'm sitting here going through my question, deciding what last three I'm going to get to wrap us up here. So I will encourage people, check out the book and look at chapter 7. It talks about sparking insights, about discovering new ideas and things of that nature. But we won't do that one today. Chapter 9 talks about tending the garden. We already covered that one. So if you want to look into more depth, I'll hear what Jorge has to say about that in more depth, and I would challenge you to go and get the book and look at chapter 9 in great detail. But there was something, I saw another episode, something you talked to somebody about something else I think is a hot topic in UX. I think we might be going outside the book a little bit here on this one, but I saw this and I was so interested because a lot of UXers, especially with all the layoffs and all the challenges and people trying to decide, do I want to stay in UX? What can I do? Should I be pivoting? And you were on a show. This topic has come up in several discussions that I've been in recently. You were talking to people about service design. What are your thoughts and recommendations for UXers who might be interested in service design? What tips or guidance would you share with them?
Well, the first thing I'll say about that is that I don't consider myself an expert in service design. That said, I do think that it's an important area to focus on. And the reason for that is that it gives you a systemic focus. to the work that you do. And what I mean by that is that it leads you to consider not just what you are doing when you are designing things, but why you're doing it and what it's in service to, right? And we started at the at the top of the conversation here. You framed the you when you set the table. You said that the important tools are the more important tool is thinking and not necessarily things like Figma. Part of the challenge with our discipline is that the sort of things that we make with Figma are incredibly charismatic. Like people love
Love
beautiful
that.
screens, right? And they show them, and it's like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. This looks so clean, or this is such a beautiful thing, right? And we are so drawn to the kind of surface level of the things that we make, and it often comes at the expense of the more strategic levels of the work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I like about service design is that it gives you a lens to see how the artifacts that we're working on fit into the broader set of interactions with the user, right? And how those interactions lead to particular types of experiences. So I do think that it's going to be increasingly important for designers to focus on the higher order design work. By higher order, I mean what are we doing here? What is it in service to? How does this contribute to value for the organization at a high level?
Yes.
If for no other reason, because a lot of the screen level design is going to be done by AIs. If you want to continue adding value, then you have to think a little bit both more deeply and at a higher level. And I do think that service design helps to do that. I think information architecture is another lens that also helps you think about it at that more abstract level. And I think it's both of those are kind of a future direction for design.
Awesome. So I know we're almost out of time here. So I've got one short question and then the standard closing question. Earlier, we mentioned Obsidian. We might not have time to get into Obsidian a lot, but I know there's Notion. I use Airtable currently. After I saw that you recommended Obsidian, I downloaded it and I love Kanban board. So I put the Kanban board in there. But what is there anything you could share with everybody about Obsidian before we get to our closing question?
Yeah, well, the first thing I'll say is it's really easy when doing this work to become to fall down a rabbit hole with tools, right? And there's a lot of I think the phrase is like a productivity porn, right? Like people who are like constantly trying new tools, and it's really easy to waste a lot of time trying out tools and trying out new methods and stuff. So I would caution folks. It's more important to internalize the ideas and the practices and the models than it is to focus on particular tools. I'll just say that right up front. That said, there are some tools that are conducive to kind of digitally native ways of thinking. You mentioned a couple of them. I think Notion is another one that a lot of folks might have heard about. I had to pick one to feature in the book so that it wasn't all abstractions, right? And so that the readers of the book could try out some of the principles. I picked Obsidian because it has low barriers to entry. Like if you're using it for personal use, it's free. It's a fairly open tool. So if you decide to not use it, you can, your stuff is on your computer. You can in an open format. So it's a good tool to experiment with. That said, it is the tool that I use for my own note taking. So it does have advantages, but again, don't focus so much on the tools.
Yes.
Focus on the ideas, right?
Yes. That's awesome. I love the way that you capsulize that as well. So we're at the end. I want to take the time to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. I am so honored to be able to speak with you. And when I talk to people like you, it inspires me so much. So thank you. But closing words today, before we sign off, what are your final words for the audience?
Well, first, a couple of final words for you. I want to thank you for inviting me on the show, and again, congratulate you on the milestone.
Mm-hmm.
This was an awesome conversation. The final words for the audience, I would say, you think with things. Don't limit yourself to think that you think only with your mind. If you realize that you think with things, then you can be mindful about the things you used to think, and you can think better. And that is so cool, right?
Yes.
So however you do it, I think that better thinking is going to benefit you, and it's going to benefit all of us. So work on becoming a better thinker. I hope that my book can help you do that. Ultimately, it's for your benefit, right? So look into it.
All right. Fantastic. So thank you again, Jorge, for your time. Maybe we can connect again. I could talk to this guy for hours. But thanks everybody for taking the time to listen on today. But it is time to sign off. This is Darren Hood. I'm the host of The World of UX. And as always, wishing everybody all the best. And until next time, happy UXing, everybody.